Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Free Market Foundation. I am Jason Emerick, and I am a director of the foundation. I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Neil Emerick, who kindly pointed out to me earlier this evening that we met over 13 years ago at an Economic Freedom of the World event that the Free Market Foundation was hosting down in Cape Town. Both of us agreed that neither of us have aged a bit, which in my case I don't think is a very good thing, but in your case, yeah. But welcome, as I said, to the Free Market Foundation. It's a pleasure to introduce Neil tonight, and it's an absolute pleasure to see so many people here tonight. I'd just like to make a few opening remarks about the FMF's relationship with the Fraser Institute, which has spanned many years. In fact, it goes back to 1984, when Eustace, and I think Leon was also present at the Mont Pelerin Society meeting, where they met with Michael Walker and decided that publishing the economic freedom, or publishing a cross-country analysis where you could analyze the economic freedom levels of different countries would be a really good idea. Of course, the index seeks to provide answers to some of the country's most pressing questions. So, for example, you might wonder why it is that South Africa currently has an unemployment rate of 29%, which means that there are over 6 million people unemployed. Of course, this isn't a very good indicator of what's actually happening on the ground, because if we look at the expanded definition of unemployment, which includes discouraged work seekers, we see that South Africa currently has over 10 million unemployed people. And the purpose of the Economic Freedom of the World Index is to analyze what policies you have in place compared to the economic policies that are in force in other countries. And the findings of the report unambiguously support the fact that countries that have greater levels of economic freedom have greater levels of prosperity, they're healthier, happier, and people just... virtually every single indicator that you can think of, and I'm sure Neil's going to go into some of the details specifically for South Africa, is better in countries that have greater levels of economic freedom. Now, I have a short bio of Neil's to read out, but he is a director and founder of Knightsbridge, which is a software company operating in the tourism industry. He started his career as a foreign exchange trader, but left the London financial markets for South Africa. There, he pivoted to writing financial software, and then ultimately founded his current business with his wife, Teresa, who is here tonight. In 2003, Emerick developed a software tool that allowed users to explore the economic freedom of the world data, correlating it with world development indicators, the World Bank development indicators, that is. And this tool is released each year with the paper version of the report. Neil has a BCom degree and is currently studying LLB at UNISA and lives in the Republic of Hout Bay. Without much further ado, please welcome Neil Emerick up to the stage.
Are we in the right spot for you, Stuart? Yes. Okay, lovely. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jason, for the introduction, and thanks for a nice warm audience for tonight. As Jason said, my involvement with the report spans 17 years now. I think it was 2001 when I was doing work here at the Free Market Foundation. We were using the Economic Freedom of the World report. It's a very large report. It's now about 3/4 of an inch thick, and it's got a lot of data points in it. So it was very unwieldy to work with. And Leon was a star in terms of producing the data in very, very accessible PowerPoint charts, you see. So we used to use the data a lot. And as a software person, I said this was unmanageable in book form. So my involvement was to put that data into a software program. And a lot of the slides that I prepared tonight have been sort of helped. I used the software to help me create the output that you're going to see. The structure tonight, I think, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to just introduce the concept of the index and how it's comprised. I know there's a lot of familiar faces here, so you will have seen this particular introduction, but think of it as a refresher for yourselves. And for the new people in the audience, then at least you can understand a little bit more about the composition of the index and what we're trying to achieve. I'll then go down into some of the results, both at a global level and then obviously for South Africa. This is what we're obviously very interested in. And then a few closing slides just to sort of suggest where the South African government might take heed of what the report is telling them, and we can live in hope, hey? So it might be helpful just to start with the definition of economic freedom. The challenge, and Leon may well remember the original Mont Pelerin Society, was to define it. It's very easy to sort of say, well, capitalist country or a socialist country, but to actually put a score down on it to a point where it can be measured properly is actually quite challenging. And there were several symposiums where the Fraser Institute sat down with people like Milton Friedman and Gary Becker and actually tried to analyse what variables would constitute the assessment of whether a country had a free economy or not. So it was quite a challenging project. There was a couple of approaches. There was sort of the idealistic approach, where you'd work from first principles. Something that the Free Market Foundation would do when we're arguing for policy is to always look at the sort of core elements of liberalism, to look at the sort of consent axiom, the role of the state and how the relationship with its citizens and in the sense of liberty, and political freedoms and how they are linked up with economic freedoms. And then there is the sort of the empirical aspect of it. So, as Leon would call it, going out into the world and looking and seeing and smelling. So this is what the other institutes do. So you've got the Freedom House that do a political index, Transparency International do the corruption index, and we have the wealth of data that we actually use, the World Bank and the Global Competitiveness Index, in our report. So this approach, rather than sort of an idealistic approach, is one of empiricism, and that's really where the Fraser Institute's report does well, I think, because it's using objective numbers from objective reports. So what we're trying to measure here is institutions. This index is used in the sort of field of institutional economics, where we're analysing the effect of institutions on economies. And this particular index is obviously measuring how consistent countries are with economic freedom. And there we're looking to see whether the degree to which the citizens get to make the choices in society about the economic structure. The alternative, of course, is being where a government would make those decisions for you. In an extreme case, we might say where there was 100% taxation, there were no economic decisions for you to make. So somewhere between 0 and 100 is one of the variables that we check. So there was the initial task for the authors of the index to figure out what it was that they were going to put in their report, and they realised that there were sort of 5 categories that they needed to sort of draw upon. So you see the list here: private property, rule of law to support the idea of contracts and private property that people could exchange and trade with each other, free trade with across boundaries, across borders, sound money, which was an interesting one to include, but of course as we've moved into the era of paper money and governments are responsible for printing that money, there's the opportunity for them to debase our savings and have a transfer of wealth in that way. So that became an important composite to the index. And a general limited role for government. The bigger the role of government, the higher the taxation. The more taxation, the less choices are left to you to make decisions. So this part is quite important. I did an interview with RS Geer yesterday, and 10 minutes after I'd finished the interview, the lady rang back furious and said that the Free Market Foundation had made a total mistake. One of the numbers that I had mentioned in the interview, she disagreed with and said that it wasn't reflective of what she felt was going on here, and the FMF must have done a shoddy job in this survey, and the report is a load of rubbish. And I said, whoa, calm down. What she didn't understand was that it's not the FMF that does any research on these things. The report itself is drawn from other reports. So it's kind of a meta report where its composite parts are drawn from internationally respected reports, the World Bank Development Indicators, Global Competitiveness Report, and it's its construction, it's its methodology of composition that the authors are sort of responsible for. They've cherry-picked the variables that they choose to measure economic freedom, but if you disagree with any of these numbers, you are at liberty to go to the source and check the actual data and see where it's moving up or down and why. We were able to do that last year. Those of you that were here will remember that we actually had to correct the index because one of the numbers for South Africa was actually wrong, and the World Bank had got the number wrong. So we were able to tell them, they were correcting it, and we were able to adjust the results accordingly. So it's a transparent report in that respect, and the methodology of construction is also transparent. It's unlike some of the other indexes where there is a little bit of discretion on the part of the authors, but that's not the case here. It's a very clear methodology. If you disagree with any of it, you're welcome to change the variables and look at the report in a different way. Okay, so there are, as we mentioned, 5 categories, large categories that the index is composed of. Area 1 is the size of government, and then we have legal system and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade with foreigners, and general regulation. Each of these categories has a 20% weight, which then is put together for the single score, which is a number 0 to 10. All the variables that we pull in from the different reports get mapped onto a scale of 0 to 10 to keep it easy, and then they are brought into their separate subcategories, and these higher level categories are then brought together with a 20% weighting. Now, we've played in the past with varying these weightings, so we've often felt that the legal system and property rights had a lot more meat than, say, freedom to trade with foreigners. The reality is several people have studied this and sort of tried with various different combinations, but it doesn't really change the meat of the results. So they've left it very simple. Everybody understands the methodology, and it seems to do the job. Okay, so I'll just whip through quickly the various categories or components that make up the various categories. So this is the sort of thing that they're looking for. In Area 1, you've got the general government consumption spending. That's a number that we can just draw from national accounts. It's basically the taxation or the consumption number that the government is taking out of the economy and spending for themselves. So you're not spending it, they're spending it. Transfers and subsidies are things like welfare transfers, pensions, those sort of things. How much, to what degree is the government involved with those sort of transfers? We've then got government enterprises and investments. So how much of the economy does the government own? And then the top marginal tax rate. Interestingly, I've just translated it into dollars, but our top marginal tax rate kicks in 43% at 700,000 Rand. That's $35,000 per year, which is sort of the US mean. So we have a very high tax rate kicking in very, very early. And then here is a new variable, state ownership of assets. This one was introduced this year. It's a new variable, and it asks the following question. Does the state own or directly control important sectors of the economy? I think the previous variable 1C was looking at how much of the economy, the income that the government was in control of. This new variable is kind of looking at the stock of assets that the government is in control of. So it's more like the balance sheet aspect of ownership rather than the sort of consumption aspect or, on state-owned enterprises. It's interesting because South Africa did reasonably well on this score, and I'm not as familiar with this new number as some of the other numbers. So here's a new website. We can go and have a look, and they're going to be drawing on this website, this data source, a lot more in future. So it's probably worth going and having a look. Yeah, we've done quite well on this score, so I'm a little bit confused, but I put that down to the fact that South Africa actually has quite a very diverse economy. So there's a lot of assets, and they are generally privately owned, even though we think of the monoliths like Eskom and Transnet. Under Area 2, we are looking at the legal system. This is the category that the lady had umbrage with me on, but Area 2's judicial independence has moved down a little bit this year, and the impartial courts. She was upset because I think she felt that the courts had defended us well over the last couple of years. They certainly had, but we have seen movements downwards in those categories. Protection of property rights has suffered greatly. We're going to have a look at that a little bit lately. Military interference in the rule of law is becoming less and less important as a statistic. Conscription used to be in here, but that's sort of fallen away. Integrity of the legal system and the integrity of the legal system is the study of the law and order, and that one we've done particularly poorly in, and that's really to do with the way that law and order is respected in the country. So you may have laws, but are they respected by the citizenry? And we do particularly poorly there. Coming up from Cape Town and watching the taxis drive on the inside lane, I can bear testimony to this. Reliability of police, that was added recently, and business costs of crime, another statistic that South Africa does particularly poorly in. Sound money we talked about. This is the ability for governments to debase your savings. So we look at various aspects of inflation. You've got money growth, which we believe leads to inflation. The standard deviation of inflation is the movement. How much is the rate moving up or down? We've steadied over the last few years, so we've done better in that score. And then there's inflation in the most recent year. South Africa is relatively high in that category. We'll see a bit more of that a bit later as well. And South Africans still have very high levels of capital controls. We still have to go through the Reserve Bank to transfer money offshore, so we can't have our own foreign exchange bank accounts. You can't have a sterling bank account with Standard Bank here in the country. So those controls still exist. Moving on to freedom with trade with foreigners. So there we're looking at the borders, the boundaries that the government puts down to stop us trading with people across the river or across the ocean. Taxes on international trade, regulatory trade barriers, things like variation of trade tariffs. If you had a uniform 5% tax across all the goods, that would be a little bit more economically free than one where a government cherry picks which industries it's going to support or hinder by special tariffs and taxes. So we've got some examples of that as well, which South Africa does poorly on. And then the last category is regulation, which is 3 big categories. A lot of this data comes from the World Bank Doing Business report, and that's the credit market, which South Africa's had some major changes in legislation in the last 5 years with things like the National Credit Act. The labour market, we've got a serious collective bargaining issues, hiring and firing practices, and of course now we have a new minimum wage law. And then there's general regulation of business. So they look at things like how long it takes to set up a business, how long does it take to close a business, how long does it take to get a license, and so on. So the advantage of an index is that rather than say just a qualitative report, is that we do come up with this single number. And it's this number that's used by econometricians in papers. They can correlate that number. It is obviously a distilled single number to describe an economy, but it's still particularly useful when you're trying to correlate it against other variables. We like it as well because in a sense you can rank countries and it becomes easy to sort of say this country goes up or down each year, so it obviously can help bring to attention movements in policy trends to government. It's something that the press love, is sort of country tables ranking and league tables, that sort of thing. But it's very useful to have a report in this form. In this year's report, there's a big PDF document which you can download, of course, that's the actual report. There's an example of a paper that this index is typically used in. Now, this is the sort of thing I've read over the last 15 years to try to understand the purpose of the index. This is used by econometricians, but unless you're into your R squared or your T whatevers, then this is not going to make much sense. But this is the sort of thing they do. And the EFW index has been used in about 600 of these sort of econometric papers. So I'll leave that to the master's students to explain to us. But we end up with nice graphs, which is much more helpful. And this is very typical of the kind of graph that we enjoy, which is to say there's economic freedom along the bottom, and there is some kind of economic output there that we're interested in. In this case, it's creative outputs. We're studying entrepreneurship in this paper. And this line tells you that statistically, the economic freedom correlates with entrepreneurship and output. And of course, we have 600 other reports that sort of follow that same pattern. In fact, Bob Lawson, who is the author of this index, or at least he was the PhD student when James Gwartney was doing it, and then he's taken over the project subsequently, he wrote a paper a couple of years back that actually analysed how often the index itself had been used. So it's been cited very, very well, 600 articles, or papers I should say. 2/3 of them correlate the economic freedom index with the output or the outcome that the paper was looking to explore. And to give you an example of some of the other papers, it would be things like migration. So does economic freedom correlate with people crossing boundaries to leave their country and go somewhere else? Well, turns out that people generally go from Cuba to America, not in the other direction. And they analysed several countries that went, say, from the Eastern Bloc countries. Where did the migration go? And they even do this in an American index as well, where they measure the economic freedom of different states. And they look at the migration between the different states and so on. And it correlates well with economic freedom. Less than 4% of the papers found economic freedom to correlate badly. So in this report this year, they've got the sort of standard charts that we just like to do to hammer the point home. The standard practice is to divide the world into quartiles and then to average out the variable that we're looking at in that particular graph. So in this one, we've got your income per capita. And as you can see, the graph goes the right way from our point of view, but we have $36,000 income for guys living in the economically free countries, where people in the least free countries are earning around $6,000. So you can work that out. What's that, about 6 times difference, which is quite a meaningful gap. You will live longer if you live in a free country. So you're more likely to die around 80 whereas you're going to struggle and have your brutish short life at 65 living in an unfree country. For one of the sadder statistics, but infant mortality, obviously you will see less infant deaths in an economically free country. There's better health services, the money obviously that correlates, but staggering statistics for those in unfree countries. This one I find is particularly interesting when you have to address the issue of capitalism and poverty and what it does to the bottom 10%. And I think the next two slides are very good at making a counter argument against that. If you're going to be poor, if you're going to be in the bottom 10% of society, where would you want to live? Do you want to live in an economically free country or in an economically unfree country? And along this graph, the choice would be simple. You're going to be earning on average around $10,600 a year if you live in an economically free country when you're in the bottom 10% of society. Whereas the unfree countries, you're earning around $1,500, which is dire poverty. And this is the other side to that graph. So we're talking about general income levels of the poor. If you're going to be poor in a free country. But this statistic is one that addresses inequality. And the common argument is that capitalism leads to inequality, but the statistics do not bear that out. In fact, they don't correlate very well at all. So if you look at the bottom, the income share of the poor is 10%. It's pretty much 2.5%, 2.4% in any country. So whatever it is that causes inequality, it's not capitalism. It's something else. You'll find examples of inequality in both capitalist countries and in socialist countries. So something else is at play that causes inequality there. The EFW report truly recognised gender rights, was it last year or the year before now, I think, where they actually incorporated the gender index from the UN in one of their statistics. So under the Area 2, the legal system and security of property rights, it was often the case that women couldn't own assets in Arab countries, and therefore half the population did not have the same rights as the other half. And this unfairly raised the scores of the countries that had laws that biased their females. So what the index did was they took the score, divided it by 2, and they multiplied one side of that by the UN's Gini index. Sorry, not the Gini index, the gender index. And then they put the score back together again. So that lowered the score for countries that had gender-based laws. And a lot of the Arab countries fell 20, 30 places in the index 2 years ago. South Africa did very well because, of course, we have no gender laws. They would be unconstitutional. So we did quite well in there. Our ranking did not change. And then one of the French president's getting more and more excited about is the happiness index. And again, we can see that the more economically free you are, the more people self-report as being happy. So outside of monetary values, economic freedom can still be a good. Right, okay, I didn't have my da-da slide, but this is where you can say da-da. So this is South Africa's 2019 result. I've plotted it here with the last 20 years just so you can see the unfortunate progression. But back in 1995, we can say where the system changed. We were 67th, coming off a sort of mid-table base. We peaked very briefly during this period of optimism here. There was an opening up of the economy, but since then we've had a very, very slow demise to the ranking this year of 101. That graphically looks like this. So you can see over the last 25 years we sort of had a little hiatus here, and then it's been a slow decline. And I've separated it here into what I'd call the 3 phases of government that we've had. So the little 5 years that was oh so brief, where our ranking improved. And here was a real opportunity, but instead of continuing on that path, we implemented a lot of laws that made major changes to the economy. and although I would say it's not the laws that have been changed, we haven't had major laws like the Employment Act or other things during the Zuma period, but I think what we have seen is our institutions undermined. And that's going to show up in some of the other statistics I have for you now, where this ranking has continued. And we find ourselves at this junction point here, whether it's the high road or the low road once again. Okay, so this is the world results. So no surprises, the top 2. Hong Kong and Singapore remain qualitatively above most of the other countries. They're exceptionally free. New Zealand has figured in the top 5 of late. Switzerland. The United States has bounced back. They fell down to about 18 3 years ago. We used to tease our American brothers in the other institutes, saying the land of the 18th most free. But they have bounced back, so we're happy to see that. And then Ireland doing very, very well. The UK is appearing, and the other UK colonies. And Mauritius maintaining its place in the top 10. I think that's a joint 9 there, so that's nice to see. Our highest African-rated country. This is the bottom of the league, and it kind of passes the sniff test. If we had to think which countries of the world would we think are least nice to live in from an economic point of view, Iran would be in there, and then the Congo. Egypt has dropped 30 places in the last few years, so that's an interesting one. That wasn't in the category of this end of the table. Syria having a major war, the DRC, it feels like it, and then Angola, Algeria, Libya, and of course Venezuela, which chose to put itself at the bottom here. They were pretty much where South Africa was 10 years ago, and they've just done everything wrong that we would have predicted, and have ended up where we told them that they were going to 5 years ago. Also, just to give you a sense of where other people sit, so United States and the United Kingdom, obviously the sort of bastions of capitalism proper. Japan's come up about 20 places recently, which is interesting. And then we have Germany hovering there, and then you've got the Frances and the Italies and the other European states. The Scandis tend to live in this region. India's done a little bit better of late. Russia pretty much maintained their ranking. Here are the BRICS countries. Brazil, decidedly unfree, also took a bit of a dip in the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years. So they're doing pretty poorly. We would predict what their economic outcomes are going to be given their position. Here are some of the smaller countries, but worth having a look at. Corné mentioned he's just got back from Georgia. We love Georgia. We spent one of the Economic Freedom of the World conferences there. My wife and I got to visit. We actually had dinner with the president. He wasn't president the next year. I think they kicked him out, so that was a bit sad. But he had an opportunity in 12 years to pick up from where Shevardnadze was, and he completely liberalized the country. He was trained at Georgetown University in Washington, and he came and implemented pretty much a libertarian agenda in Georgia, and it transformed the place, and they have done exceptionally well. They have moderated some of the policies subsequently, but I think they've got this tremendous momentum now, so we're still very keen and want to follow that story. Denmark's one of the higher placed Scandis. South Korea we would see in there. Jordan, one of the more liberal Arab states. I was there in November for the Arab Economic Freedom of the World report. The gender issue was raised there, which was very interesting and was a very sensitive debate. Uganda and Botswana appearing in the first quartile, or just under the first quartile, which is very interesting. They've always done very well, but these guys have moved up the rankings. The UAE, they've dropped. They used to be at sort of 25, 30, but because of the gender correction, they've now dropped into the mid-60s. Something like Saudi Arabia is now in the 90s and 100s. Mexico, Turkey, one of South Africa's peers, considered on the emerging markets. Ukraine, and Zimbabwe has come up 15 places. So in the last few years, we have seen some improvement there, which is interesting to follow. Unfortunately, this is the section of the table where South Africa now lives. So if you were to try and find countries of comparable economic freedom, this is where you'd be looking, and you'd see countries like Turkey, Suriname, Belarus, Brunei, Greece and Ghana. I mean, this is a sort of sad bunch neighbourhood to live in. So very unfortunate we fall into this section of the table. And of course we're all having to remember now to change the name at the bottom there, but I left the old one in just for you if you hadn't kept up to date. This is a slide that we've brought in the last couple of years, which is Africa generally. And there were always a couple of countries that used to pip South Africa, and now unfortunately we are the ones who are falling and lagging down the table. So Uganda and Botswana are leading the race. I've left Mauritius there at the top. But on the continent at least, you've got Rwanda still implementing reforms, which is very good. These guys were surprised. I didn't know these guys were doing much. Kenya, I'm aware of. I mean, we do business up in Kenya, and it's definitely become more open. Things like being able to do banking, the fintech sector is very, very interesting up there. Yes, you do bump into police roadblocks, so you get a sense that there's that bit of corruption going on, or a lot of corruption going on. But business is being done, and it's very, very interesting. And there's a lot of tech companies up there, a lot of software companies up there doing good work. So I can personally testify to say that smells about right for Kenya. Have a look at this one, Nigeria. So they were always in the 120s and the 110s, and they've come up quite significantly. So about 3 years ago, their GDP surpassed South Africa. They now surpass us in economic freedom as well. We also have an office in Nigeria, so we can testify to that one as well. And then this is where we sit. So we are now below Tanzania for economic freedom, and only slightly above Lesotho, Mali, and then of course the guys who are struggling at the bottom. This slide is the countries who've had the biggest progression in the last 5 years. I do it over 5 years because in 1 year the movement's often quite small. So a 5-year chunk is a time for, gives time for policies to kick in and so on. But a couple of interesting ones here. I mean, Iceland there, Cambodia. Cambodia is obviously following in the footsteps of Vietnam. I think as the US is decoupling from China, we're seeing some of that, the logistics sort of channels are moving to the other countries in the Far East there. So it's interesting to see if their policies are going to follow and that they're going to be brought more and more into the sort of international trading system. So I'm interested to follow that one. Malaysia doing very well as well. So that's quite a free country and opening up. So we should see a lot more interesting stuff going on there. And Nigeria here, we obviously want to see our big cousin doing very well. And then to invert that, these are the countries that we would expect to see problems start arising. And Papua New Guinea, I'm not sure, I don't know anything about Papua New Guinea, but they're up to something. The UAE has dropped basically because of the gender ranking. Egypt has dropped a lot, obviously a lot of troubles going on up there. And Turkey as well has kind of dropped from around the 70 mark to the 95, so very much comparable now with South Africa. We also like to see what the trend is for economic freedom globally. And this chart shows that in 2017, which is the year that we're looking, 2 years back each time, is that economic freedom has fallen for the first time in about 15 years. So this is quite interesting. It's only a very moderate drop, but it did seem to lose some momentum. And you know, there is a certain concern that we're seeing the rise of authoritarian governments, we're seeing more intervention and so on. So it's interesting. This is obviously 160 countries added together. So that is an interesting turn in the wrong direction. What I haven't done in the past is this slide, which is to actually take the entire world and compress it into a single score, and then take all the various policy parameters that we monitor and diff them between the current year and the previous year. So I'd normally do this for South Africa, and you'll see their slides a little bit later. We can see where the policy changes are taking place. But I thought it might be interesting just to see what the world's doing. And I thought it was quite interesting. So in the last 5 years, we've seen freedom of foreigners to visit. So the world is opening up. So that's quite considerably. When you move into the 6 band, it's a very moderate score, whereas 4 tends to be basket case. So the world average to move to this is very, very positive. There's a lot of travel going on and workers being exchanged, which is interesting. Licensing restrictions has gone from a fairly good number to slightly better. Controls of people and capital, again, going in the right direction. Starting a business was already quite high and moving up. And cost of tax compliance also moving up. General government consumption looks like a small movement, but that can be quite significant, 5.5 to 5.7. And the reliability of the police also gone up. The corresponding slide is where things have gone down. The compliance cost of importing and exporting, this is one of those sort of tiny numbers that we have in Area 5, Area 4, freedom to trade with foreigners. What they do is they say, what is the standard cost to bring in a 20-foot container of dry goods? And they can pretty much get that statistic for every country in the world. So it's a kind of an accurate statistic. And what's interesting is how that has gone down in economic freedom. It's become more expensive to import things. So based on the other statistic, it looks like the people are moving, but the goods are moving less. Not quite sure what's going on there. Extras, payments, bribes and favoritism. So this is where other mechanisms are used to get business in a society. That's a score that unfortunately has fallen. Regulatory trade barriers has fallen. State ownership of assets has gone up. I guess people get a little bit cocky after 2008. and they had to nationalise some of the institutions. We have negative real interest rates is starting to be felt more and more. Business costs of crime. This integrity of the legal system, again, that's not a reflection on the courts, but a reflection on the police and the institutions and the prosecution of crimes. And the regulation of work hours there at the bottom. So it's just an interesting sniff test. What's interesting, when I show you the South African slide a little bit later, you'll see that we've got about 5 or 6 of those ones in the same position that we do. And it seems to me, if you were just to put the slides next to each other, that we seem to be copying the world trend. We're one of those countries where it's just exceptionally average. We're actually borrowing and doing everything that the world average is doing. So these are our positive trends. Again, I'm not quite clear why we've seen this movement. We would have to dig a little bit deeper. But apparently we've moved up a notch. Some of that might be explained by other countries doing worse things, and then we're not so bad as them. Some of the score does relate to our relative position, but I'm not quite clear why this number has moved as much as it has. It's still bad in terms of 3.5. We know collective bargaining, we have low scores there. This was the number I mentioned about the tariff rates. South Africa has very cherry-picked tariff rates on its industries. We're protecting some and we're not protecting others. More labour laws, state ownership of assets. Our inflation is very high. National Credit Act here. And then, this is positive. I beg your pardon. These are all very small movements positively, but we do seem to have made some progress here, but I'm not quite clear why. And Leon maybe can explore that later. These are the negative movements for South Africa. So again, this was the first one that we saw on the world average, but we seem to have complied here in a significant way. Extras, payments and bribes. Would it surprise you to learn that corruption, favouritism and everything has gone up considerably in South Africa, and that we've got a much lower score? And this has affected our overall ranking considerably. This is the Area 2 section. This is a very significant movement. This is another one. We've moved out of the sort of comfort zone into the sort of 5s, which is always a bad sign. But this is the protection of property rights. So how confident are people feeling that they can secure a debt or secure property? Is their contract secure and so on? So we are failing here somewhere. Impartiality of the courts, the judicial independence. Again, this is also the and integrity of the legal system is much to do with the police as it is to do with the courts. And of course, we've never done particularly well on the reliability of the police and general business regulations. I just brought these peers in as well, just to give you a sense of where we sit relatively area by area. So this is area 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So here is Kenya at 7.4. So they have a smaller government than ours. Well, I think it was kind of explained by the amount of wealth transfer and the taxes that South African government is able to extract. So although they have a small government, it's sort of an ineffective government. So we do see those sort of higher numbers for some of the African countries. Unfortunately, this is where African countries have historically done poorly with poor legal systems, but Kenya now outscores South Africa for the overall quality of the legal system. So that's switched around in the last couple of years. So that's not a good sign. Sound money, as I've said, Kenya has an open economy. You can have currencies in bank accounts in different currencies. There are no capital controls there, so they're more open than we are. Lower inflation than we have. Freedom to trade, pretty much the same, and our regulation is a little bit better than theirs. In terms of rankings, you can see we're sort of comparable here, a little bit lower here on the, this is years. This is I beg your pardon, sorry, I got confused with my areas again. So this is the years across the top and Kenya's ranking over that period. So they have also had a decline in economic freedom over the last 20 years, but not as significant as ours. So our big brother up north, they also have a low government score, or it's a high economic freedom score, low size of government compared to ours. Unfortunately, they don't have a particularly strong legal system, as we've witnessed. Reasonable inflation levels, not as good open to trade as we are, but less regulation than we have. And this is why they've got a better score than us this year. This is the Nigerian history over the last 20 years of the index. So they were very much in the 100th brackets and the 112s, and then they suddenly started moving in the right direction about 4 years ago. So this is an interesting change. The other large country that we're often compared to is Turkey. And I thought I'd bring that one up just to have a squiz. So the size of government, again, smaller government than us. We have a slightly better legal system than they do. They are better on the sound money. They're a bit more open to trade than we are, but they do regulate a bit more than we do. And Turkey has also pretty much remained stable in the sort of late 90s over this period. And again, that's ours relative to them. So this is very much sort of our emerging market peer. And then I draw these numbers from the World Bank Development Indicators, but just give you an idea of what's happened to the South African economy over the period that I've shown you where we've had the demise in economic freedom. So that is the South African average income in constant local currency unit. So I think that's 2010 rands. But you can see that we are about 25%, maybe a bit more, 30% richer than we were in 1995. We are objectively richer. But what's sad is the flatlining, if not general downward trend, in those last 4 years. So our incomes per capita are starting to fall. Here are our growth rates. So we were in the 2-3% kind of comfort zone here, and then we hit the Zuma period, and then we started flatlining or with negative growth. Bear in mind, South Africa has had 1%, 0.5% growth. This is the number that makes it onto the press, but that's not the per capita growth. Okay, we've had a growth in the population that has exceeded our economic growth. So it's actually the pie is being divided by more slices. In dollar terms, you can see again, we are richer objectively, but we are flatlining here, if not going downward. And what do we sense from business? Does this economic freedom demise, is it showing up? Are we seeing these numbers? Well, I don't know if you saw yesterday, there were 2 reports that came out in terms of South African confidence, business confidence. We had the South African Chamber of Commerce release their report saying that we were the worst in 20 years or 25 years, going back to apartheid days. That was not very inspiring. And then there was the Rand Merchant Bank that also came out with their equivalent that also put us down to lowest levels of confidence. So our businesses are just not prepared to get involved in the economy at this stage. So why is that happening? Now, this is a number that we used to follow quite carefully, and those countries with high levels of growth consistently have high levels of fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP. When I used to plough through this data and try and find one statistic that was the key to it all, this was the number that had the highest correlation. So if you have a high correlation to growth, if you have a high fixed capital formation, you will tend to have a high economic growth rate. So the high growth countries, this number is typically between 25 and 30%, which means they're replacing their capital stock every 4 years. Whereas South Africa has consistently maintained sort of, well, we were in this sort of 16, 17 type area. We had a little bump up, but then we seem to have come down again now. Now, this is the fixed capital formation for the economy as a whole. This is the private sector, and you can see what's going on. It's about 3% difference from the government's one. The government seems to have been consistent across the top here, but the private sector one came up, and then in the last 3 years has gone down quite precipitously. So there's been a big drop in investment from the private sector in the last couple of years. So to finish off, I've got a couple of slides really just to look at sort of the policies that we might look at, the homework, if you like, that we need to investigate, dig deeper, think about, study the reports that are bringing us these numbers, and we're seeing the single statistics, but we have to understand those statistics and look to see what policies are hurting those numbers and what we can do to change them. So here is a ranking of the sort of worst variables that South Africa has. We've always been poor on the labour law side, so the centralised collective bargaining and hiring and firing. It's very difficult to hire and fire in South Africa relative to other countries. We're ranking in the bottom quartile there. Our business costs of crime, unfortunately, South Africa has been a very crime-affected society. We had the numbers out today. The murder rate's the highest now in 10 years. So these are things that we have to address. Our top marginal tax rate, still very, very high relative to other countries. Starting a business, they've got us down. I find this number a little bit hard because I mean we've opened up companies and things. It doesn't seem to be, but I think it depends what kind of company you're opening. If you're opening a manufacturing company or a drug company, you might find the burdens quite onerous rather than say a software company. The reliability of the police, again, we've never really done very well. That numbers came in a couple of years ago and we've never scored well there. And this is the new number that is interesting that it's popping up globally, but this is the 20-foot container. We seem to be charging a lot more to bring it in. General government consumption, we're paying way too much in the form of wages and we don't seem to be getting our buck's worth. But the government wage bill has got to come down and their general spending has got to come down. We still have 11 of the 13 capital controls, and this number is very scary. I'm going to go to that a bit more on that on the next slide. And inflation, you might think that 3 to 6% inflation is low, but it puts us in the one of the worst categories in the world, actually. So where everyone else is fighting negative inflation, we still have 4 or 5% inflation. So it's not good. To put in graph form, the different categories. So you can see the ranking. I showed you the one where we moved to 101st, but this is for Area 1 size of government. So in the last 20 years, we've gone from 32nd to 113th. The score hasn't moved very much, but it tells you that the rest of the world has moved on. They're selling their state-owned enterprises, they're privatising, they're liberalising, and they're doing less in the economy. And our ranking has changed accordingly. This is the legal structure and property rights. So you can see we did quite well. We bumped up here, and then again we've kind of had this fall off here to 84th in the last 5 years. So this is a trend that could be very worrying. 66th to 99th, we generally had sound money. Our inflation wasn't varying up and down, which makes business planning hard, but we still have a high inflation rate. And then freedom to trade, 52nd here, down to 96th. Again, not much movement in the score, but if the rest of the world is moving on, our ranking goes down. And regulation from 19th here to 74th. Again, the score hasn't moved very much, but the world has been liberalising and deregulating and getting rid of the red tape. There has been, I mean, we have a representative here who's involved with the World Bank Development Indicators from the UK. I think it's fair to say they are focused worldwide on these World Bank Development Indicators and trying to remove red tape from their countries, but we have not been doing that. So in summary, we've got a size of government that's 113th, so we are continuing our trend towards larger government. Our legal system and security of property rights, I've got one more slide for that because I've got particular concerns on that one. I'm going to break that down a little bit more, but we are definitely dropping in an area that we had historically scored reasonably well on. Sound money, as I've said, 3 to 6% puts us in the worst 30 countries in the world. It doesn't sound very much, but at 6%, you lose half your pension every 12 years. So it's quite a significant inflation rate. Freedom to trade with foreigners, we're at 96th, and regulation of business. We could do a lot more to free up and cut the red tape and liberalise our businesses there. So this is the category that I have the biggest concern with. So I think just take a look at what's been happening here. So judicial independence has dropped from the mid-20s to the 40s. So although RSG got across and said the courts are still defending us, yes they are, but we went from very good to fairly good. So that's not something that we should be proud of, and I hope it's not a trend in the wrong direction. Impartial courts, again, we were top rankings in the mid-teens, 12th, 13th in the world in terms of impartial courts, but we've dropped into this mid-40s bracket. So the trend here is not good. This one, where we've dropped from the mid-20s to 78th, we can think about the nationalisation of mineral rights, we can think about the nationalisation of water rights, and now, of course, we can think about the possible change to Clause 25 in the Constitution, expropriation of property. So there's some scare which is picked up in surveys about property rights in this country and whether they're secure or not. The integrity of the legal system is a function of law and order. You can think of the corruption, if I can call it that, the degrading of the institution with the National Prosecuting Authority over the last 5 years, 10 years. That's showing up in the numbers. It's about law and whether law is respected in the country, and this indicator would show that it's not. Our reliability of police, still very poor. We have poorly educated, poorly trained policemen, and that's showing up as a very poor number in the bottom quartile. And then the business costs of crime, which still remains a very high number in South Africa. All of these are very, very dangerous when they're in area 2, because it seems to be one of the more meaty categories. So we need to pay particular attention to this. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, we have a couple of other areas that we have some concerns about. Our tariff rates, again, we're still cherry picking across the industry. Now, from the mid-80s to 134th, there's only 160 countries. So we've got some of the worst variation in tariffs across the board. We mentioned this one already, into the mid-40s. Capital controls, we still have capital controls. It's no wonder, really, if they took them away, would all our money fly out? Who knows? This one has come up, and again, I think that's a symptom of the Zuma period over the last 10 years. We now rank 126th in the world. So that's a number that we had not done well in. I think we were around 80s and 90s, but we've dropped significantly there. And we're still in the poor zone for hiring and firing and bureaucracy costs. So all of these areas are policy targets for us in terms of making improvements. So Ramaphosa referred to these wasted years, the last 9 years. And I think we can see where Mbeki was ambitious in working towards a developmental state. He made a conscious decision to pass laws to create a developmental state. And we would argue that he was successful in that endeavour because it showed up exactly on the economic freedom score. We saw the score continuing as each legislation was passed. We see something different over the last 5-6 years where our institutions were undermined. And it's area 2 where we've had the biggest hits and real danger, real damage, I think, has been done. We have to solve this problem if it's not going to bankrupt us. We were talking earlier, and Mboweni said there will be no more money for the state-owned enterprises, and then they gave 300 million to South African Express yesterday. So that kitty is still there. They're still drawing on it. If they're taking it from there, then it's not being used elsewhere, and that's obviously a dangerous sign. So we have to address this problem, and if we don't, it'll address us. I think this one is not going to go away, and we do not have much time left on this one. Thanks for the time. I've tried to explain how we understand the concept of economic freedom, why we believe that economic freedom is an important right. It's different from political freedom. Hong Kong is economically free, but Singapore is not politically free, yet it is economically free. There is a distinction there, but we would argue economic freedoms often come first and have the biggest impact, and political freedoms often follow. They're a definite element for economic growth. If you look at other variables like fixed capital formation, you need the animal spirits of your businessmen to be excited about the future. And they need certain guarantees to be in place, a secure legal system, a certainty that their property is going to remain theirs over the period of time, that the money is going to stay stable, they can make planning and predictions. So without these things, without those sort of economic principles, you won't be able to go forward. And then we also had a little look at how economic freedom impacts on other aspects of society, happiness, gender equality, and so on. It's not just about the money, it's about other social aspects too. And we showed you some charts where we looked at things like the different quartiles, and where the more economically free countries, the more economically free you were, the chances are you had a higher income, you lived longer, you were happier, and if you were poor, you were likely to be quite wealthy poor. In summary, and you'll forgive me if I read this, but I think it's important. So in 20 years, the Economic Freedom of the World Index has given weight to the argument that free markets and open trade promote the results promised. Academic investigation continues to find strong correlations between economic freedom and the outcomes valued by human endeavour. It also allows us to drill down and investigate movements in variables thought important to economic freedom. And in this way, we may begin the discussions important to our policy debates. Now, I'd now like to invite you to investigate these data, and my contribution to the Economic Freedom Project is a software version of the report. Here is the URL. There's a Windows-based version where you can download this software. The idea is that you can pick up 3 variables. You can pick up the countries of the world, the time periods that we've got data for, and the various statistics. We've got 55 statistics on the economic freedom side. But you can also open the entire World Bank development indicators. I supply that with the data so that you've got something to correlate against. There's about 1,600 variables in that report, so there's plenty of fun to be had seeing what economic freedom correlates with. You pick your 3 variables, you can lay out the axes any way you like, and then you can start squishing countries together to form areas or quartiles. Maybe you want to put geographic countries together and see what's happening. You can have a lot of fun, play with the data, and then have fun producing charts and graphs and see what makes for nice slideshows. 2 years back, for the Mac users, we created a cloud-based version of the product. So now you just need to go to efwdata.com, you register your email address, and then it gives you a URL. You just type that URL in and you have access to this software, and you can pull in any of the variables that I've talked about in the talk today. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll be here for more questions.
Do you want to take questions now?
Yeah, and if they start bullying, I'll refer to the chairman. At the back, thank you.
Maybe a comment. Thank you for cheering us up. What's the way out?
That sounds like needs a glass of wine. We've been following this so closely, and we've been so involved at the Free Market Foundation for so long. I mean, I've been here 17 years. Leon, how long have you been doing this?
Since before the Permian extinction.
Permian extinction, right. So it's been a while. Is something going to break? Politically, I can't see any energy or momentum, any political force that's going to change direction. I really can't. And that's very pessimistic. And unfortunately, I have to concur with Bill Johnson, if you've read any of his recent reports. I think he's spot on. He might have been off by a year or two, but I don't know that we'll fall into the hands of the IMF. There's a significant difference between us and Argentina, which is that almost all of our debt is denominated in rand. If they wanted to, they can just print loads more of it, and they can pay all their bonds off. So that's not the issue. I don't think we're going to go bankrupt in the same way as Hemingway sort of described. But the reality is Eskom is draining the fiscus. And so are the other things. So I think we are going to break. We're going to have to keep going until we break. And maybe it's Ramaphosa's plan to break, because then somebody's going to have to pick up the pieces. But unfortunately, I don't see any other way out of this. I think we're going to keep going until the water boils and the frog dies. But we'll survive.
Yes, I think one can be quite pessimistic. Just looking around at the complexion of the audience here tells me that the government is not paying attention to any of this. The question I have to ask, is it linked to levels of education? And what is the link between EFW and levels of education?
Yeah, there are papers on that. We did a crude one here. We found very little correlation with, we weren't looking with economic freedom, we were looking at economic growth. Obviously that was what we were interested in sort of chasing as an outcome. We found that secondary education didn't correlate very well with economic growth at all. Basic education, sort of 5 to 10, had some statistical impact. But you can still get wealthy. Sorry? Oh. We can still get wealthy. Countries can still get wealthy with low education levels, but then they have their hands to use. But then you have to have an economy that's geared to labour. We don't have that, but neither do we have the education, and therefore we have the unemployment that we see. So, we can say education is the answer if you want a high value-add economy. We don't have to choose that route if we don't have to. We could actually just choose to free up the labour market and then choose an alternative manufacturing labour type route.
Just on that, there are many things that cause economic growth, and high economic growth doesn't necessarily from high education. In fact, if we increased our education levels in this country at the moment, we just increased the number of people who are highly educated who were unemployed.
Yeah,
and in fact, at the moment, my experience is many black and white people of a youthful age are emigrating.
I don't think it's a realistic policy choice here to say that we'll fix our schools and get out of the problem that way and build a high value add economy. Seems extremely unlikely given the past. So I think we are going to have to grow out of our problems, and that necessarily means some cheap labour. But it doesn't seem to be. There doesn't seem to be any other way around that. I think it's unrealistic to think that everyone's going to have a PhD.
My By the way, were you agreeing with Bruce Johnston or Boris Johnson?
I told you earlier, I'm not going there. One country at a time.
But can cheap labour compete with where industry is going with the fourth industrial revolution and all the technology changes we see?
Who knows? I mean, I feel like the guy, selling the horse bug and buggy and whippy. But there we go. We don't know, do we? That's in the field I'm in, that's a very interesting question. I always think of capital. It's capital, and I think of capital in these terms. If you tell a man to dig a trench and you give him a spoon, he can achieve so much in one day. But if you give him a JCB digger, he can achieve a lot more in one day. Now that comes down to capital. It's the same labour. And I would be optimistic in the sense that this fourth generation of software will actually enable people. That it will take people without an education necessarily, but enable them to do things that they couldn't do before, and that will all be uplifted. So you have to take an optimistic view there. Otherwise, the pessimistic view is that the robots are going to do all the work. And that's fine. Then we'll just have a social wage, and maybe that's the way we'll go. But actually then we can give up the libertarian thing because the problem's been solved. The robots are making our food. That's great. I think there's a question there for you?
Exactly.
He answered it. Okay. Fantastic.
All right. I don't know if you can give me a forecast about what's the thought of Hong Kong with the protests and stuff. Are they going to stay at number one going forward? For 2043
Yeah.
or something.
Again, I'm a born optimist. I think they've won this battle, right? They've done exceptionally well. I mean, we were all rooting for them because they're top of our list, so we all kind of had an interest and watched the television and so on. And there was real, genuine spunk there by the protesters. They got out there and they took the tear gas, So that was a real wake-up call for China. Our hope is that China's liberalising quite a lot internally. I mean, they don't score very well overall, but they've got provinces that are exceptionally free internally. And that's creating a dynamic, I think, that means China's going to have to open up. So I think Hong Kong might be a symptom of what's going to explode in mainland China. So I remain optimistic there. I think they've put their foot down and it's okay for now, unless they're going to put the boot down. And I don't know that they want to get away with it. They've got enough on their plate right now that I don't think they want to go there politically and globally. We'll see. That's a prediction.
So it just occurs to me that 6 of the 10 top countries are islands, in fact, at least 6. But I think 5 of those are really instructive examples. So apart from Hong Kong and Singapore, Ireland and New Zealand and Mauritius, and what's the other one? At least Ireland, Mauritius and New Zealand have made tremendous progress, specifically after introducing liberal reforms and freeing up their economies, and we shouldn't forget that example.
No, agreed. And a paper's been written on that. So you can have a look. There's two interesting papers. One is length of coastline and how much you're surrounded by water. So there's papers there. And navigable rivers. So it's interesting that Africa doesn't have many navigable rivers, unlike the Danube and the Rhine and so on. So there's some economic growth studies that do actually look at things from that perspective. But I don't know. I don't know whether the length of your coastline affects your economic freedom. That might be a coincidence. Or the English were there, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. Good. I think if there's no more questions, we can adjourn, Leon, maybe.
Yeah, Jason, I'll do the closing just because Jason's apologised. He's got a flight to get and gone off to catch it. So thank you to Neil for, I think you'll all agree, a truly outstanding analysis of the data. And he always does us proud. He seems to come up with something new every year, a new way to look at it. And it does explain why some countries are successful and others not. I think when we look at some other data, for example, country size, country history, country race, religion, whether it's got a coastline or not, whether it's landlocked, whether it's big or small, none of those produce any kind of enduring correlation with the country's performance. The only thing that does is its economic system. Nothing else matters. And I just close with referring to Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, or what used to be called Black Africa, was the only part of the world that was getting poorer during the last generation of the last century. And it is now the fastest growing region in the world. So It used to be wondered whether this had something to do with race. I don't see people now saying, well, clearly black people are genetically superior. That's why it's now outperforming the rest of the world. So it's not about any such factor. It's about economic systems. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.